Hey everyone, I noticed a lot of you who are watching and enjoying the content aren't subscribed yet. If you love spine-chilling stories, creepy encounters, and unexplained mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the next terrifying upload. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more of the content you love. I never thought a simple Uber ride could turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. It was just another Friday night, and I was heading out to meet some friends at a new bar downtown. I pulled up the app, requested a ride, and waited on the curb. When the car pulled up, I didn't think twice about getting in. The driver seemed friendly enough, smiling and asking how my day was going. I gave the usual polite responses, not really in the mood for small talk. As we drove, he kept asking questions. At first they were normal, where I was headed, if I had plans for the weekend. But then things started to get weird. He mentioned the company I worked for, even though I hadn't told him. I figured maybe he had seen my work ID or something, but then he asked about my recent promotion. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about that yet, not even my closest friends. How could he possibly know? I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, but each one more unsettling than the last. He brought up my childhood pet, my first kiss, even the time I cheated on a math test in 8th grade. Things no stranger should know. My heart was racing now. I gripped my phone tightly, ready to call for help. But who would believe me? What would I even say? The driver's tone changed. He wasn't asking questions anymore. Now he was talking about my past mistakes, things I'd tried to forget, the time I lied to my best friend and ruined our relationship, the horrible things I'd said to my mom during our last fight before she passed away, secrets I'd never told a soul. I felt sick to my stomach. This couldn't be happening. How did he know all of this? Was I dreaming? Had I somehow gotten into the wrong car? I glanced at the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror. For a split second, they looked completely black. I blinked and they were normal again. But that image was burned into my mind. His voice taking on an ominous tone. He said he'd been sent to make me face my past, to pay for the things I'd done. That I couldn't run from my mistakes anymore. I was shaking now, tears streaming down my face. I wanted to jump out of the car, but we were on the highway. There was nowhere to go. As we drove, the city lights began to fade. We were heading out of town. This wasn't the way to the bar. I tried to speak, to tell him he was going the wrong way, but no words came out. My mind was racing. Was this some kind of sick joke, a hidden camera show? But deep down, I knew it was something much worse. Something I couldn't explain. The driver's words became more cryptic. He talked about judgment and consequences, about forces beyond our understanding. I started to wonder if he was even human. I closed my eyes, praying for this nightmare to end. When I opened them again, we were parked in a dark, empty lot. The engine was off. Silence. I don't know how long we sat there. It felt like hours. He turned to face me. His eyes were normal now, but there was something off about them. Empty, soulless. He said my time wasn't up yet, that I had a chance to make things right, to face my past and become a better person. If I didn't, he'd be back. In a blink, I was standing on the curb outside the bar. My friends were there, asking if I was okay. Apparently, I was an hour late and wasn't responding to their texts. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of the car or the driver. My phone showed no record of the ride. It was like it never happened. But I knew the truth. I could still feel the fear, the absolute certainty that I'd experienced something beyond explanation. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I wrote it off as a bad dream or hallucination, but I know better. I can feel eyes on me sometimes, watching, waiting. I've been trying to make amends, to right my wrongs. I reached out to that old friend, volunteered at a shelter, called my dad more often. I don't know if it's enough, but I do know one thing for certain. I'll never take an Uber again. I didn't think much of it when I ordered an Uber after Sarah's party. It was late, I was tired, and I just wanted to get home. The app said my driver would arrive in 3 minutes. Perfect. When the car pulled up, I double-checked the license plate before getting in. Safety first, right? The driver seemed friendly enough, smiling and asking how my night was going. I gave a polite but brief answer, hoping he'd get the hint that I wasn't in a chatty mood. As we drove, he kept making small talk. At first, it was just generic stuff about the weather and how busy the city was tonight. But then he started mentioning things that made me pause. He asked if I'd enjoyed dinner at Giovanni's last week. I froze. How did he know I'd been there? I definitely hadn't mentioned it. I tried to brush it off, figuring maybe he'd seen me there or something. But then he brought up my cat Milo by name, asking if he was feeling better after his vet visit. A chill ran down my spine. I never post about Milo online, and I certainly hadn't told this driver about him. My heart started racing as I realized this guy knew way too much about me. Had he been following me, tracking my movements? I tried to stay calm on the outside while my mind raced. I needed to get out of this car. I glanced at my phone, planning to text a friend for help, but there was no signal. Of course. I looked out the window, trying to get my bearings. We should have been on Main Street by now, heading towards my neighborhood. Instead, we were on some road I didn't recognize, trees lining both sides. Panic set in as I realized he was taking me somewhere else. Somewhere isolated. I had to do something, fast. But what? I wasn't strong enough to fight him. Could I jump out? We were going pretty fast. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think clearly. I remembered a self-defense class he took years ago. The instructor for being taken somewhere against your will, do whatever you can to avoid the second location. That's where the really bad stuff happens. Making a split-second decision, I leaned forward like I was going to be sick. I started gagging and coughing, saying I was going to throw up. The driver looked alarmed and started to slow down. As soon as the car slowed enough, I flung open the door and tumbled out onto the shoulder of the road. I hit the ground hard, scraping my hands and knees, but adrenaline took over and I scrambled to my feet, sprinting into the woods beside the road. I could hear the car screech to a halt behind me, the driver yelling, but I didn't look back, I just ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I had no idea where I was going, just that I had to get away. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I couldn't run anymore. I ducked behind a large tree, gasping for air. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of pursuit. But all my own pounding heartbeat and ragged breathing. Slowly, my panic started to subside enough for me to think clearly again. I needed help, but I still had no cell signal out here in the middle of nowhere. I took stock of my surroundings, trying to get my bearings. In the distance, I could see lights. It looked like it might be a gas station or rest stop along the highway. If I could make it there, I could call for help. Taking a deep breath, I started moving in that direction, staying alert for any sign of the driver. It took over an hour of stumbling through the dark woods before I finally reached the highway. The lights I'd seen turned out to be a 24-hour truck stop. I must have looked a mess when I burst through the doors, dirty, scraped up, wild-eyed. But the woman behind the counter took one look at me and immediately locked the doors and called the police. While we waited for them to arrive, she gave me some water and a blanket. I was still shaking, the reality of what had almost happened hitting me hard. When the police got there, I gave them my statement. They seemed skeptical at first, but then they ran the driver's name from the Uber app. Turns out he had priors for stalking. They assured me they'd track him down. The next few weeks were rough. I jumped at every sound, barely slept, and couldn't bring myself to be alone. But slowly, with the help of friends and a good therapist, I started to feel safe again. I deleted all my social media accounts and beefed up my online privacy. No more oversharing for me. Looking back, I'm amazed I had the presence of mind to escape like I did. I guess survival instincts really do kick in when you need them, but I'll never take my safety for granted again. These days, I drive myself or get rides from people I know and trust, and I'm a lot more careful about what information I put out there for strangers to find. It was late, way too late to be out on a Thursday night, but here I was, exhausted from a work event, just wanting to get home. I pulled out my phone and ordered an Uber pool, hoping to save a few bucks. Big mistake. The car arrived quickly. I climbed in the back, giving a tired smile to the driver. He barely nodded. Whatever, I thought. It's late, we're all tired. A minute later, we pulled over to pick up the other passenger. A man got in next to me, tall and thin. He didn't look at me or say anything. I shifted closer to the door, suddenly uncomfortable. As we started driving, I noticed something off. The driver kept glancing in the rearview mirror, not at the road, but at the man next to me. They seemed to be communicating silently. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off. You're just tired and paranoid, I told myself. But as the ride continued, my unease grew. We weren't heading towards my apartment. We seemed to be going in circles, passing the same streets over and over. I cleared my throat, about to say something. But before I could, the man next to me shifted. He was still staring straight ahead, but his hand had moved to his pocket. Was he holding something? I couldn't tell, but I didn't want to find out. My heart was pounding now. This wasn't right. I needed to get out of this car, but how? We were on a busy street, but the doors were locked. I'd have to ask the driver to stop, and something told me that wasn't a good idea. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Get out now. I froze. Another buzz. They're not taking you home. My blood ran cold. How was this happening? Who was sending these? I glanced at the driver and the other passenger. They were both facing forward, seemingly oblivious, but there was tension in the air, like they were waiting for something. Another text. Next red light, be ready. I gripped my phone tightly, my palms sweating. The next intersection was coming up. Then red. The car slowed. In that moment, I made a split-second decision. I hit the unlock button, shoved the door open, and ran. I heard shouts behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, my heels clacking on the pavement, my lungs burning. I ducked into an all-night diner, breathing hard. The waitress looked concerned, but I waved her off. I slumped into a booth, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed again. I almost dropped it. But this time, it was a message from Uber, asking about my aborted trip. I laughed shakily. How could I even begin to explain? I sat there for a long time, sipping bad coffee, jumping at every sound. When the sun came up, I finally felt safe enough to call another ride. This time, I didn't choose pool. I never found out who sent those texts, or what would have happened if I'd stayed in that car. But now, every time I get into a rideshare, I can't help but remember that night. The strange glances, the feeling of being trapped. It's enough to make me want to walk everywhere, no matter how far. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. Maybe I was just overtired, seeing threats where there were none. But then I remember the texts, the warning from an unknown protector, and I know it was real. I reported the incident to Uber, but they just sent a generic response about taking safety seriously. The police weren't much help either, without any real evidence of a crime. So I'm left with this story, this warning to others. Be careful who you ride with, especially late at night. Trust your instincts, and maybe, just maybe, avoid Uber pool. It's been months now, and I still get jumpy in taxis. I've started driving more, even though parking in the city is a nightmare. My friends think I'm being paranoid, but they weren't there. They didn't feel the menace in that car, didn't see the silent communication between the driver and passenger. I've tried to move on, to forget about that night. It was just another Friday night out with friends. We'd been celebrating the end of midterms at our favorite bar near campus. By the time we decided to call it a night, I was tired and ready to head home. My roommate had left earlier, so I figured I'd just grab an Uber. I stood outside the bar, shivering a bit in the cool night air as I waited for my ride. The app showed my driver was only a few minutes away in a silver Honda Civic. When a car matching that description pulled up, I didn't think twice before hopping in the back seat. As soon as I closed the door, something felt off. The driver barely glanced at me and didn't say a word, not even to confirm my name or destination. I brushed it off, figuring he was just having a bad night or wasn't the chatty type. I was too tired to care much anyway. We set off down the street, and I settled back, scrolling through my phone. After a few minutes, I noticed we seemed to be going in the wrong direction. Up to double-check the route. That's when I saw it. The little car icon showing my actual Uber was still several blocks away from the pickup spot. My heart started racing as the realization hit me. This wasn't my Uber. I was in a stranger's car. I tried to stay calm and think of what to do. Should I confront the driver? Try to jump out at the next stop? Call the police? My mind was spinning. I clutched my phone tightly, hovering my finger over the emergency call button. The driver still hadn't said a word or even looked back at me. Where was he taking me? We turned onto a road I didn't recognize, heading away from the busy downtown area into a more industrial part of town. There were fewer cars and people around. My panic was rising by the second. I decided I had to do something before we got any farther. At the next red light, I was going to make a break for it. But as we approached the intersection, the light turned green and we sailed right through. Blocked as I watched helplessly from the back seat, I was kicking myself for being so careless. How could I have gotten into a random car without double-checking? It was such a stupid mistake. Finally, we slowed down as we turned into a parking lot. It was some kind of office building, dark and deserted at this time of night. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The car came to a stop and the driver turned off the engine. This was it. I had to act now. As he started to open his door, I lunged for the handle on my side and practically fell out of the car. I scrambled to my feet and took off running as fast as I could. I heard the driver yell something behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran and ran until I reached a main road with some traffic and businesses that were still open. Gasping for breath, I ducked into a 24-hour diner and asked to use their phone to call the police. The whole time I was shaking, watching the door to make sure the driver hadn't followed me. When I gave them my statement and description of the car and driver, they took me home and said they'd investigate, but I knew the chances of catching the guy were slim. I was lucky to have escaped, but the experience shook me to my core. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping and jumped at every little noise. I kept replaying that night in my head, imagining all the terrible things that could have happened. It took time, but eventually the fear and anxiety started to fade. I became much more cautious about rideshares and always triple-check the car and driver info before getting in. I make sure my friends do the same. I'll never know what that driver's intentions were or where he was really taking me. Part of me doesn't want to know. I'm just grateful I trusted my instincts and found a way out of that situation. Now when I go out, I try to stick with friends or take public transit when possible.